Maggie Astor, the fantastic reporter over at the New York Times, joining us here on the Can We Please Talk podcast. Maggie, Mike, and Nick, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Maggie, I wanted to get into one of the pieces you just recently posted today, and I reached out to you. I truly do read a lot of your articles and follow you. She's a great follow on social media, by the way, folks. You just recently posted an article about elections and giving people kind of a where do I vote this week? And some of the big races that are happening. I live in New York City. The mayoral race is happening here. You have the governor race that's happening in Virginia. Why don't you take our audience, if you can, a little bit into that piece and overview and really some of the key races and where can people vote? There's a bunch that you put in that article. I would love for you to dive into that with our audience.
Absolutely. So there are a number of races on the ballot on Tuesday, depending on your state. There will be statewide elections for governor in Virginia and New Jersey. There are also various statewide elections in Colorado, Maine, Pennsylvania, Texas, Washington State, and those range from an election to the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania, to various ballot initiatives, constitutional amendments, referendums, that sort of thing. And in addition to those statewide elections, there are elections happening at the local and county levels in many other states. And there's really too many local elections to list, but if anybody goes to their state's election website or Secretary of State's website, or to a third-party reference like Vote 411, for instance, you can look up exactly what's on the ballot in your area.
Maggie, in the coverage you've been doing around that, are there obviously, the Virginia election stands out. I formerly lived in New Jersey, so obviously we pay attention to that. New Jersey, of course, is one of the few states that does the election on the odd number, but that is how New Jersey rolls. But aside from those governor races, what are a couple of races that stand out to you that's not getting nearly as much attention but do hold sway? You mentioned, for example, the Supreme Court election in Pennsylvania.
Yes, there is. And I haven't been covering that election specifically, so I can't go into a lot of detail about it, but certainly the state Supreme Courts in any state are a really, they are really underrated, I think, in terms of their importance. Those are the courts that are resolving huge questions. They're resolving the constitutionality of various state laws under the state constitution as opposed to the federal. They hear lots of election law challenges. The state Supreme Courts, whatever state you're in, are really incredibly influential. And in many cases, including in Pennsylvania, they are elected, and they're actually, elected sometimes partisan offices, unlike at the federal level. So that's absolutely something that if you live in Pennsylvania, you should be paying attention to that.
Oh, perfect, because Nick lives in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, exactly. On the subject, when we think about elections, I also think about recently a just really awesome article that you wrote about the possibility of a particular voting rights opportunity or voting rights legislation that is getting at its origin some bipartisan support. And this speaks specifically to Indigenous people. Maggie, could you take us more through that?
Yes. So that's referring to the Native American Voting Rights Act, which was introduced in, I believe, August it was introduced in the House by Representatives Tom Cole, who is a Republican from Oklahoma, and Representative Sharice Davids, who is a Democrat from Kansas. And that bill essentially would let Native American tribes determine the number and location of voter registration sites on their reservations, as well as the number and location of polling places, ballot drop boxes. It would prevent states from closing or consolidating those sites on reservations without the consent of tribal leaders. And it would also require states that have voter identification laws to accept tribal identification to fulfill that requirement. And So this is it's a very targeted voting rights bill, but it addresses what has been a really major voting rights issue in recent years. There have been huge obstacles to voting for Native Americans, especially on reservations, because of the geographical obstacles. They often live in pretty remote areas. The infrastructure isn't always strong. Many of them have to travel, long distances to vote or even to register to vote. They don't always have traditional addresses or reliable mail service. So voter ID laws that require a residential address as opposed to a PO box can be problematic for them. So they are definitely one of the groups that has been very heavily affected by voting restrictions in the past few years. And the fate of this bill is totally undetermined. It's still in very early stages, and it's impossible to say whether it will get enough support to pass. But the fact that it does have those bipartisan sponsors is more than you can say for most voting related legislation.
Well, Maggie, I mean, I hate to play Captain Obvious here, but I'm wondering, there's certain things that you meant in there, that you said in there, right? Groups that are affected that can't get to polling places, right? A lot of that stuff is happening in states right now, specifically in Texas. We saw what happened in one of their biggest counties and the rules that they changed there. We've had a couple correspondents on from some of the Texas papers down there. Why can't something like this, at least a framework of this for universal voting rights, why can't it get some type of bipartisan support at the federal level? Am I being reductive in saying that it's all because of the big lie and what one party is continuing on, or is there more to that?
I mean, the issues surrounding the lies about last year's election and the, stoking of this false idea that, that it was stolen or that various aspects of it were fraudulent or all of that. Yes, that is certainly fueling an enormous amount of the partisan division on this point. Essentially, former President Trump has made it kind of an item of Republican loyalty to go along with these lies, and has attacked many Republicans who don't go along with them. So there's certainly pressure there. And I mean, but even before the 2020 election, there was a very stark partisan divide on voting rights. And even in past cycles, there have been a lot of restrictive laws passed at the state level, overwhelmingly by Republican state legislators. And there have been efforts at voting rights legislation at the federal and state level, mostly by Democrats. So that partisan divide really does predate Trump. And I don't know that I can, illuminate all the history and reasons behind that in a short period of time. But certainly President Trump's, comments and rhetoric have exacerbated it.
Yeah. There's really no other way to sort of sum that up aside from that. On the subject of voting, redistricting obviously is part of this conversation too. I know you've done some reporting around that, specifically as it relates to, I believe, like 14 districts that are sort of part of this conversation. Maggie, can you take us through sort of where we are currently with this conversation about redistricting and what impact are you seeing potentially with maybe not so much this election, but with 2022?
Yeah, absolutely. Redistricting is going to be a huge factor in determining who controls Congress after the 2022 elections. Some of my colleagues have done reporting indicating that, it is at least theoretically possible for Republicans to retake the House solely on the basis of redistricting, simply by creating more safe Republican seats. And we have certainly seen that playing out in some states. The governor of Texas signed a map the other day that is designed to be very favorable to Republicans, that is gerrymandered for Republicans. But there are a couple, factors making it such that the advantage for Republicans based on gerrymandering might not be quite as stark as had been expected, say, last year. Republicans do absolutely still have an advantage in gerrymandering. There's no question about that. But because of a couple states that Democrats control, New York and Illinois mainly, Democrats are likely going to have more opportunities to do their own gerrymandering than it seemed like they might last year. And another factor is that the census numbers that came out, the really detailed data, was a little more favorable to urban and suburban areas than had been expected. There was more population loss in rural, conservative-leaning areas, more population growth in cities. And so that sort of population breakdown made the numbers a little more favorable for Democrats. But simply by virtue of the fact that they control more state legislatures, Republicans do have the advantage there, and they've already cemented that in Texas, although I'm sure there will be lawsuits over that. And the processes in many other states are continuing. While a few states have passed their maps, we're still in the early stages of the process overall.
Maggie, I wanted to shift gears because and one of the reasons that I invited you on the program was I saw an article of yours about vaccine mandates and how they're an American tradition. And so is the backlash. And we recently had Ellie Honig on the program, the former DOJ prosecutor and CNN legal analyst, talking about, and this was around August, talking about the legalities behind mandates. And it was really around what Governor DeSantis was doing in Florida with the cruise lines, right? And mandating that they couldn't allow, vaccine passports, and then the cruise ships circumventing that by saying, okay, you can hang out on this part of the boat. I would love for you to take our audience through a little bit of your article and what it referenced back when smallpox was happening and the mandates, but then also how we see history repeating itself. I find it myself, just for me, and again, I'm a minor in law, I find it hysterical that people don't understand mandates, that people don't understand, a company changing its policy to add a rule. And if you don't adhere to it, you will lose your job. You don't have a constitutional right to play point guard for the Brooklyn Nets. So I'm shocked that people don't get this, but you have historical information and you spoke with a professor about this. So I would love for you to take our audience through that piece.
Yeah, absolutely. So I certainly know that the current situation feels in many respects like surely this must be a historical aberration. Surely it wasn't like this in the past. But it very much was. Obviously, before smallpox was eradicated, there were many smallpox outbreaks in the early United States and in the colonies, even before the United States. And even as far back as the Revolutionary War, actually, George Washington mandated smallpox inoculations. Vaccinations didn't exist then, but they would actually take some live smallpox virus and rub it into an open wound to create a mild infection that would guard against severe infection later. Obviously, that was much cruder and much more dangerous than modern vaccinations, to say the least. But nonetheless, Washington mandated smallpox inoculations for the Continental Army. during an outbreak there because he was concerned that if smallpox were to tear through the army, it would be more dangerous than anything that the British could throw at his army. But where things really got interesting and where we really see the parallels today is at the turn of the 20th century. So around 1898 to 1903, states started imposing smallpox vaccine mandates in response to some really severe outbreaks. And people freaked out. There are, news articles and health board reports from that time describing crowds of parents marching to schoolhouses to demand that their unvaccinated children be allowed in. There were actually some people who smallpox vaccination leaves this very characteristic scar on the arm. So it's hard to, it's not like you can just fake a vaccination certificate. So some people would actually burn their arms with acid to mimic the smallpox vaccine scar to get around these mandates. That's according to Michael Wilrich. He's a professor of history at Brandeis who has written about the history of smallpox and vaccine mandates in the U.S. So there was intense opposition to the mandates at that time. And that culminated with the Jacobson v. Massachusetts ruling in 1905. That was a Supreme Court ruling that basically, that legally speaking, it resolved the question of whether mandatory vaccinations were constitutional. It said yes, they were. And there is a relatively famous, I guess, within the realm of people who study these things, quote from the ruling from Justice John Marshall Harlan, who said that the Constitution, quote, does not import an absolute right in each person to be at all times and in all circumstances wholly freed from restraint. Real liberty for all could not exist under the operation of a principle which recognizes the right of each individual person to use his own, whether in respect of his person or his property, regardless of the injury that may be done to others. So basically, you don't have it's kind of a very fancy way of saying your right to swing your arm stops at my nose. And so legally speaking, vaccination mandates are on very solid ground because of this ruling in 1905. That's been resolved for a long time. But in terms of, public opinion, the issue has never been resolved. And vaccines we've had since then where you didn't see as much opposition, like you didn't really see this sort of response to polio vaccinations or until relatively recently to measles vaccinations. But the thing about those was that initially they weren't mandated. The mandates came later. And so the historical analogy that's really most comparable to the current situation is the smallpox one, and people reacted very much the way they did now.
That's great insight. I didn't know some of that. So that's great insight. I appreciate you sharing that, Maggie.
Absolutely.
Especially love that quote from that justice. The darn shame doesn't apply to gun laws. Anyway, he's thinking about just going back to legislation in terms of what we're seeing federally. Recently we've seen the constant, battle between Senator Joe Manchin, with the Democrats, in terms of most recently as it relates to paid family leave. Mm-hmm. Maggie, what's your read so far in terms of some of these federal bills, or some of these bills that are being brought up in terms of infrastructure and some of the other initiatives that the Democrats have been sitting on for quite a while and seem like there's pressure to start making some headway in the form of voting?
Yeah, so that's not really my wheelhouse. I mean, I've certainly been following it, but the congressional reporters in our Washington bureau have been taking the lead on that. But certainly I can say that the White House and congressional Democrats really want to reach a deal on this budget reconciliation bill, the what was originally a 3.5 trillion package. It's now being cut down to maybe 1.5, 2 trillion. It's all in flux. But that includes a lot of social safety net and climate provisions. And President Biden in particular would really like at least the framework of a deal on that in the next day or two, because he will be going to a international climate summit in Glasgow that starts, I believe it starts over the weekend. And he really wants to be able to go there and say, look, Congress is going to pass this bill with these specific climate measures. The US is doing its part, and he wants to, have that in hand to sort of pressure other countries to also take action to reduce emissions. Really remains to be seen whether they will reach that framework agreement by that deadline. Things are still really in flux. Obviously, Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema, they have been objecting to a number of provisions in the bill, and in particular, a number of mechanisms used to pay for the spending in the bill, various, tax reforms. So, that's really what I can tell you about where it stands.
Maggie Astor, you do fantastic work. I say this all the time. People probably get sick of me saying fantastic, but I wouldn't put normal people on. I put people that do fantastic work on. Maggie, she's a great follow on social media. I truly do love all your articles. I really did appreciate that vaccine mandate article. So thank you for that. Continued success to you. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.